this portion of the review goes back to the things we talked about the first few classes of the semester. For example, what is political science? It's the study of politics, right? So that's a discipline that applies the scientific method to questions of government, power, politics, and public behavior. For our purposes up to this point, we've mainly been discussing questions of government and power. Now, what is politics, right? If political science is the study of politics, what is exactly that we're studying? Politics is the process through which individuals or groups reach agreement on a course of common or collective action, even when they disagree on the intended goals of that action. But of course, this clearly leads to collective action problems. If politics is about collective action, then we need to solve these problems. For example, there are coordination problems. When we have multiple parties that might be working towards different goals and we need to coordinate them somehow to work towards the same goal. For example, in the Senate, all 100 senators are considered pretty much equal. But if that's the case and they all have their own goals, such as re-election, how do we get them to coordinate to do things like pass laws? Prisoner's dilemma is a little bit different. This is when people actually know that agreeing to coordinate gets them the best solution. However, if they do something on their own that undermines that good solution, they still come out okay. Now, logically, if you know that someone else is thinking, well, if I just work to my own selfish goals, I come out fine, but you know that then the collective goal isn't going to work, you think, well, I should work towards my own selfish goals too, because I'd rather come out fine than come out not at all well, right? So the prisoner's dilemma is basically when coordinating would get everyone what they want, but you can't guarantee coordination, so people behave selfishly to get something rather than risk getting nothing. The tragedy of the commons is when everyone has access to, say, a common good of some nature. However, they use this good to ruination. Basically, they costlessly consume it until it is all gone or ruined in some way. The final major collective action problem that we look at is free riders. Right? Free riders are a collective action problem. They often cause tragedies of the commons by costlessly consuming that common good. So we need to eliminate free riders, right? People who get something for nothing. And to do this, we often have to create institutions. In fact, institutions can solve all types of government problems. All types of collective action problems. For example, we have rules and regulations. These would help with our coordination problems in the Senate. If we have rules such as how long people can speak, by implementing the cloture rule, for example, that stops filibusters, we can facilitate collective action by preventing filibusters and allowing for shorter debate and eventual passage of a law. Jurisdiction. Great example of jurisdiction solving collective action problems is with the court system. Right? We have the dual court system where there are state and federal courts, and we know which has jurisdiction over what issues. But even in the federal court system, jurisdiction helps facilitate collective action. The court system is generally slow and reactive rather than proactive, but to help facilitate any action at all, despite these limitations, we create jurisdictional rules. So district courts have the widest jurisdiction. Most cases start there. Circuit courts, of which there are fewer, right, circuit courts of appeals, those almost only hear appeals cases. They really don't have much of an original jurisdiction, right? Only an appeals jurisdiction. And appeals only are heard if there is standing or grounds for those appeals. So not every appeal will have to be heard. When we finally get up to the Supreme Court, we know they have an extremely limited original jurisdiction. The vast majority of their cases are heard under their appellate jurisdiction, and again, appeals do not have to be heard. This helps them lighten the load and allows them to hear only appeals that are very important. Then when they hear these appeals, because they have the ultimate decisive power, they are then able to tell lower courts who are under the Supreme Court's jurisdiction how to use Supreme Court rulings, right, and how to decide certain matters of law. So we've just seen jurisdiction, rules, and decisiveness. Obviously, decisiveness can also come in with something like the decision to have a unitary presidency, right? There's a concern that if we had more than one executive, it would be more difficult to have a decisive voice in the executive branch, especially when it came to foreign relations. Agenda power and veto power are related, though a little bit different, right? Who gets to tell people what is going to be on the agenda can help facilitate collective action. We know that Congress has to deal with basically every issue facing the nation. But they're not going to deal with every issue facing the nation. They're only going to deal with what's on the agenda. So who gets to set that has a lot of power. That's why the president has a lot of power with proposing his budget, because that sets the agenda for budget negotiations. Likewise, the courts have a lot of power in setting their agenda, because the Supreme Court at least has this power, because they can choose which cases to hear. They can set their own agenda. Veto power is basically the opposite. So instead of telling people what's going to be on the agenda, you tell people what isn't, what is not allowed. Obviously, the classic case of veto power is the president's veto. Delegation can often touch upon issues of jurisdiction, right? If we know that something is a limited jurisdiction, presumably that's because they have been delegated some power. In the case of the court system, right, the Supreme Court has ultimate power, but they've delegated the ability to decide cases to the lower courts. Then they can review the cases and decide if there are things that they need to weigh in on. In Congress, we have committees who have been delegated power to deal with individual issues, thus reducing information costs for the entirety of Congress. In the executive, the president often delegates bureaucratic tasks to the bureaucracy. Finally, we have enforcement and oversight, who can oversee things that get done. Well, the president oversees his bureaucracy. Right? Now, he doesn't have ultimate enforcement power over many of the bureaucrats, because civil service laws protect at least the lower level ones. But certainly the president can fire cabinet level secretaries if he wishes. But that oversight is limited for the president, which can actually enhance collective action problems like problems of hidden information and hidden action.